It didn't happen when she left. It happened the morning after, when I stood in the kitchen, poured my coffee, and realized I didn't know what I liked anymore. For 30 years, I drank it the way she made it. 2 sugars, no cream. That morning, I took a sip and thought, is this even my taste or just habit? And it hit me. It wasn't just my coffee I had lost touch with. It was my voice, my hunger, my presence. I had spent decades being a husband, a father, a provider. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being me. She didn't just leave a marriage. She left a man who had disappeared long before she walked out the door. You don't notice when it starts. One day, she stops asking what you want for dinner. Another day, you stop asking how she slept. Not because you don't care, but because the silence between you has become comfortable, or maybe just familiar. You tell yourself it's normal. This is what happens after decades together. After all, life is busy. There are appointments, responsibilities, medications to refill. You've got bills, aging parents, grown-up kids who barely call, and you're tired. Tired in a way only men over 50 truly understand. So you go through the motions, you fix what's broken around the house, you check the garage door twice before bed, you mow the lawn, you nod at her across the dinner table, you show up to family events, take the vacation photos, hold her coat. You think, this is love. This is what it's supposed to look like after 30 years. And at night, you lie next to the same woman you've known for 3 decades, but it feels like sleeping beside a memory. There's no anger, no betrayal, no yelling, just a slow drift. 2 people sailing the same ship, but on different maps, different destinations, and deep down, there's this quiet ache. Is this it? Is this all there is left of love? You don't say it out loud, you wouldn't know how, so you swallow the ache every day until one day she doesn't. His name was Mark. He was 57 when she left. They had been married for 31 years, not perfect years, but solid ones. Reliable, built on routines, quiet understanding, and decades of coexisting. Every Saturday, he changed the oil in the car. She folded the laundry in neat little squares. They made coffee every morning at 7:15, black for him. 2 sugars for her. They didn't talk much anymore, but to him that wasn't a problem. He thought silence meant peace. He believed love was about loyalty, stability, showing up. He didn't see the loneliness creeping into her, didn't notice. When she stopped laughing at his dry jokes, when she no longer reached for his hand, when she started going on long solo walks, without saying where she was headed, when she smiled more in photos with friends than she did at the dinner table. He didn't notice the emotional bag she packed long before the suitcase came out. Then, one Thursday evening, she asked him to sit down. She wasn't crying, she wasn't angry, her voice was steady, almost too calm. She said, "I don't want to keep disappearing next to you." He blinked. "What are you talking about?" "I don't feel seen anymore, Mark. I haven't, for years." He opened his mouth to argue, to remind her of all he had done. The years of working, providing, staying faithful, but the words didn't come because something in her eyes told him she had already left. Not physically. Not yet, but emotionally she had crossed a threshold he hadn't even seen. That night she didn't slam the door. She didn't cry, didn't break plates, didn't accuse. She just packed a small overnight bag, kissed him softly on the cheek, and walked out. The house didn't feel broken. Not right away, it just felt paused, like someone had pressed mute on his life. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot. Out of habit, he made 2 cups, one black, one with 2 sugars. Then he stopped and looked at his hands. Do I even like black coffee? Or have I just never questioned it? That small moment cracked something open. For the first time in years, he sat in the stillness. Not out of exhaustion, but out of reflection. He looked at the man he had become, a man who kept the gutters clean, remembered anniversaries, stayed faithful, but also a man who hadn't cried since his father's funeral, a man who mistook routine for intimacy, who thought love was maintenance, not presence. He started to see it. How many nights she came home looking tired, and he never asked why. How many times she hinted at her sadness, not in words, but in silence, and he turned up the TV instead. How often she sat beside him, on the couch, waiting for touch, and got a scroll through the news instead. She hadn't needed him to rescue her. She needed him to notice, to witness her, not manage her. And maybe, just maybe, he needed to be noticed too. That night he didn't drink, he didn't run, he just sat there, eyes open finally, staring into the space she once filled, not in grief, not in anger, but in something deeper, the beginning of self-recognition. Dr. John Gottman spent decades studying why marriages fail, not with guesswork, with science, heart monitors, cameras, emotional tracking in his love lab. He watched couples interact, recorded every sigh, every flinch, every pause, and over time, a pattern emerged. It wasn't infidelity, it wasn't money, it wasn't even conflict. It was disconnection. The real predictor of divorce, Gottman found, came down to something he called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, 4 emotional behaviors that silently erode a relationship from the inside out. Criticism, defensiveness, contempt, stonewalling. And Mark, like many men over 50, had no idea he was inviting all 4 to dinner every night, not because he was cruel, not because he didn't care, but because he was quiet, emotionally unavailable, unaware. Let's break it down. When she told him she felt alone, he said, "You're overthinking." That was defensiveness, the refusal to take in emotional feedback. When she cried quietly beside him in bed and he turned on the game instead of turning toward her, that was stonewalling, shutting down, retreating emotionally. When she forgot the dry cleaning again and he muttered, "Why am I not surprised?" That was contempt, sarcasm, belittling, hidden anger. And when she tried to express her needs and he snapped, "So now I'm the problem," that was criticism, even if he thought he was just being honest. But here's what no one told Mark, or most men his age. We were never taught to emotionally connect. We were taught to fix, to perform, to carry burdens, not to feel, not to open, not to say, "I'm hurting too." So when our partner reaches out, not with a problem to solve, but with a feeling to share, we freeze, we go into logic, we minimize, we withdraw, because presence feels unfamiliar, because emotional intimacy requires vulnerability, something we were taught to avoid at all costs. But here's the truth. Most women don't leave because they stop loving. They leave because they feel invisible, because every emotional bid they make is ignored or misunderstood, because love, in its truest form, is not something you can give without being present to receive. Over time, when bids go unanswered, something in them gives up. They stop knocking, they stop hoping, they stop reaching, and intimacy doesn't collapse overnight. It fades, quietly like sunlight at the end of the day, not in a storm, but in silence. Gottman calls it the slow death of love, one missed moment at a time. One quiet sigh unheard, one "How was your day?" that never got asked. Mark didn't fail because he was a bad man. He failed because he thought being there was enough. But love doesn't live in proximity. It lives in presence, in emotional courage, in being willing to say, "I see you, and I want to understand." And without that, even the most faithful, stable marriage will slowly dissolve into quiet regret. In the days that followed, Mark didn't reach out, not because he was proud, not because he was waiting for her to come back, but because for the first time in his life, he realized he had nothing real to say. Not yet. Not until he figured out who he had become when no one else was looking. He wandered through the house like a guest in a museum. Every room still held her presence, a scarf on the door, a hairpin on the sink, A grocery list written in her cursive, but what haunted him most wasn't her absence. It was the presence of someone else he'd abandoned, himself. He found old journals in the attic, blank. He picked up his guitar, dusty, one string broken. He opened the closet and saw rows of clothes he hadn't chosen, just accepted. He walked past a mirror and paused. The man staring back looked familiar, but tired, not just in the body, in the soul. And then the questions came. Who was I before I became useful? Who am I when no one needs me? What have I been avoiding by being so busy being everything for everyone else? The questions scared him because they pointed to a truth he had buried for decades. He had built a life that looked right, but never asked if it felt right. He had mastered responsibility, but forgotten curiosity. He knew how to protect others, but not how to connect with himself. That was the real turning point. Not her leaving, but his beginning. He stopped blaming her rage for the silence, the distance, the slow emotional erosion. He stopped blaming himself for not knowing what no one ever taught him, and instead, he took something far more powerful, responsibility. Not for the past, but for the next step. So he started small. He brewed his coffee a different way each morning, experimenting with cream, cinnamon, even oat milk. He journaled. Clumsy words at first, but honest. Raw, sometimes angry, sometimes soft. He pulled old books off the shelf, philosophy, poetry, things he once loved but forgot. He started walking every evening, not for fitness, for stillness. He scheduled therapy, something he once mocked as not for men like me. In one session, the therapist asked, "When was the last time you let yourself be seen?" Mark sat silent. His throat tightened because he didn't know. He realized he had spent most of his life performing roles. Husband, father, worker, provider, but somewhere along the line, the man got lost inside the mask. And what his wife had needed, what he himself had needed, wasn't performance. It was presence, not strength without emotion, but strength that could sit with pain, not solutions, but attention. Not fixing her, but facing himself. He began to see his greatest mistake wasn't what he didn't do for her. It was what he never offered to himself. Forgiveness, patience, permission to feel. So no, he didn't run after her with promises or grand gestures. No last-minute flights, no flowers, no speeches on the doorstep. He stayed still. He faced his shadow, the fear, the shame, the numbness, the old belief that feeling is weakness. He let it come up, not all at once, but in waves. Some nights he cried for 5 minutes, other nights for none. Some days he felt peaceful, other days rage, but he didn't run. And as the days turned to weeks, something inside him shifted, not quickly, not loudly, but slowly and inwardly. He began to feel whole. Not because someone else returned to love him, but because for the first time in decades, he returned to love himself. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Mark had spent most of his life doing the right things, being a good man, a reliable man, a strong man. But no one had ever asked him to be a whole man, and the truth was, he had no idea who that even was. He had mastered the surface, the visible self. But beneath that, in the corners of his soul, lived a stranger, a part of him he had silenced to survive. The sadness, the rage, the longing, the creative spark he left behind in his 20s, the little boy who never learned how to say, "I'm scared." Jung called this the shadow, the hidden part of ourselves we reject, deny, or fear. We bury it beneath work, silence, distractions. We wear masks, the provider, the stoic, the peacemaker, and slowly we forget not just who we are, but that we ever were anyone else. Mark realized he hadn't lost himself when she walked away. He had lost himself long before that. In routines, in expectations, in being. what others needed, instead of who he truly was. And love became a projection. She didn't fall in love with him, she fell in love with the image he showed her. The edited version, the capable one, the strong one, the silent one. And maybe he had done the same to her, falling in love not with a woman, but with the comfort she provided, the role she played, the mirror that reflected back his usefulness. But when the projection faded, what was left? Not clarity, not closure, but an invitation to individuation. Jung believed that real healing begins when we stop living through roles and start becoming whole, not perfect, not polished, but authentic. So Mark began the journey inward. He faced his shadow, not to destroy it, but to integrate it. He allowed anger to surface without shame. He let grief move through his body like a tide. He listened to the parts of him he had once mocked, the artist, the dreamer, the boy who missed his mother. And slowly he stopped searching for answers out there, stopped blaming love, or women, or himself. He saw what fell apart wasn't just a marriage, it was the scaffolding of a self that was never truly seen, not even by him. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough, a sacred unraveling, a falling away of every false identity he had clung to, so that something deeper could emerge. Not a better man, a truer man, a man who doesn't need to be needed to feel worthy, a man who doesn't perform love, but lives it, a man who no longer runs from the mirror, because now he recognizes the eyes looking back, and for the first time, he belongs to himself. If any part of this story feels familiar, if you've ever sat across from someone you love and still felt invisible, if you've spent years being there but never really present, if you've carried the weight of being the strong one, the one who never breaks, never cries, never needs, then this space is for you, not to fix, not to explain, but to finally be seen. Leave a comment below and finish this sentence. I want to be seen, not just stay, because you don't have to say much, just enough to remind yourself and others that you still matter, because you're not alone, and your story might be the very thing another man needs to begin his own journey back to himself. Let's start a different kind of conversation, one that begins with presence and ends with truth.